In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the Prior Imperi of Tempo Man con las personas que fights 1,000 wars across a million worlds. Under the undying will of the Emperor of Mankind, humanity endures through faith, sacrifice, and unrelenting brutality. Hive cities burn, space marines die in glory, entire systems vanish in sanctioned exterminatus, and still mankind survives. Because survival is all that remains, but the Black Ash Crusade was different. It did not begin with a Black Crusade from the Eye of Terror. It did not begin with the tendrils of a tyrannid hive fleet blotting out the stars. It began with a report so mundane that most administratum clerks nearly buried it in parchment. Unidentified particulate precipitation. The shrine world of Virlax Prime had always been a beacon of devotion in the segmentum obscurus. Its cathedrals rivaled those of Terra in grandeur. Pilgrims crossed light, years for the chance to kneel upon its sacred basalt steps. Entire generations lived and died within sight of statues honoring the Emperor's sacrifice. Faith saturated the planet like oxygen. Then the ash fell. Black particles descended from a clear sky, drifting softly across spires and plazas. Ecclesiarchal authorities declared it a sign holy residue from the Emperor's eternal war against the enemies of mankind. Pilgrims collected it in vials. Preachers anointed their brows with it. Choirs sang louder. Within days, the singing stopped. Astropathic choirs stationed on Virlax began reporting interference in the warp. Messages to nearby systems arrived distorted. Some did not arrive at all. Navigators felt a thinning in the immaterium around the system, a stillness that was deeply unnatural. The coughing followed. Citizens collapsed in the streets without wounds. Workers fell at manufactorum stations. Entire congregations froze mid-prayer. No plague markers registered. No viral strain could be identified. Medici servitors returned only one consistent result: systemic molecular destabilization. Then the ground began to tremble. When the Imperial Navy cruiser Glory of Terra translated from the warp, Admiral Halbrecht expected rebellion or chaos incursion. Instead, orbital scans showed infrastructure intact, power grids active, defense platforms silent, life signs were vanishing. Halbrecht deployed Astra Militarum regiments into Hive Sanctus. Thousands of guardsmen descended into streets layered with black residue. Their boots left impressions in ash that seemed to shift slightly after each step, as though disturbed by unseen currents. Inside the central basilica, they found 10,000 bodies kneeling in perfect symmetry before a statue of the Emperor. None bore wounds, all were dead. Sergeant Valen of the 82nd Cadian reported tremors beneath the hive's substructure. Seismic readings indicated hollow cavities far deeper than any imperial records suggested. Before further analysis could be completed, the city's foundation split open. They rose in silence. Necron warriors phased through stone and ferrocrete alike, emerald eyes igniting in the ash-choked air. Their Gauss flares emitted thin beams of green light that did not explode or burn. They unmade. Guardsmen struck by the beams dissolved into drifting particles, flesh unraveling at the atomic level. There were no battle cries from the Necrons, no hatred, no sound except the hum of ancient machinery. Deep beneath Virlax Prime lay a tomb complex older than human civilization, long before the Imperium. Before the Age of Strife, before even old Terra's first empires, this world had belonged to a Necron dynasty. Now it was awakening. Overlord Zathrek, the Unshackled, stirred within his stasis chamber as tomb reactors roared to life. His consciousness reassembled from fragmented data shards stored for millions of years. Surface scans flooded his awareness. Organic infestation, primitive architecture, religious iconography erected atop sacred ground, correction required. The ash was not a weapon in the human sense. It was a planetary sterilization protocol. anoscopic constructs released into the atmosphere to destabilize biological matter and suppress warp resonance. A cleansing tide meant to prepare the surface for reclamation. To the Necrons, this was maintenance. To the Imperium, it was apocalypse. Admiral Halbrecht watched real time feeds as entire regiments were erased. Vox networks collapsed into static. Orbital augers detected energy signatures deep beneath the crust, shielded by materials beyond Imperial comprehension. He understood the only viable response: prepare cyclonic torpedoes. Exterminatus was not declared lightly. Billions of loyal Imperial citizens remained on the surface, but the alternative was unacceptable. A fully awakened Necron tomb whirled in the heart of Imperial territory would spread beyond containment. Torpedoes fell like judgment. Virlax Prime cracked open in holy fire. Oceans vaporized. Cathedral spires melted into rivers of molten stone. Shockwaves rippled through the mantle as the planet's surface was scoured clean, but the tomb complex endured. Phase-shifted shields absorbed the worst of the cataclysm. Deep within reinforced chambers, Zathrek observed the destruction with cold indifference. Organic life had annihilated itself in fear. Predictable, as the planet died, vast plumes of black ash were expelled into orbit, caught in gravitational tides, and carried into neighboring systems. The Black Ash Crusade began not as a declaration, but as containment. Within months, nearby worlds reported identical phenomena. Clear skies turning black, warp disturbances, population collapse without conventional infection. And beneath each afflicted planet, seismic anomalies hinted at something buried far older than Imperial settlement records indicated. The Ordo Xenos took command of the investigation. Inquisitor Malvek studied fragments recovered from destroyed Necron constructs. Cell repairing necrodermis, energy signatures that dampened psychic activity. Archived data referencing ancient conflicts between Necrons and entities known only in fragmented myth. The C'tan, the Old Ones. Malvek presented a chilling conclusion before a secret conclave. This is not invasion. This is reactivation. High Lords authorized a sector-wide military mobilization under a new banner, the Black Ash Crusade. Its mandate was absolute: identify ash-affected systems, destroy tomb complexes before full awakening, sanction exterminatus where necessary. Space Marine chapters answered swiftly. The Black Templars saw it as divine trial. The Ultramarines deployed strategic strike forces to secure vulnerable systems. Even the Grey Knights monitored the warp anomalies, suspicious of chaos manipulation. But chaos was not responsible, and that realization unsettled many, because as the ash spread, something unprecedented occurred. Warp storms weakened in affected regions. Astropathic choirs reported diminished background resonance. Navigators described the immaterium near ash zones as thin, less turbulent. In some systems, minor demonic manifestations collapsed instantly, unable to sustain cohesion. The Necron protocols were suppressing the warp itself. For 10,000 years, humanity's survival depended upon warp travel guided by the Astronomicon. Without it, the Imperium would fracture into isolated clusters of worlds, unable to reinforce one another against the galaxy's horrors. If the ash expanded far enough, it could create null regions spanning entire sectors. Chaos would weaken. But so would mankind. The first major fleet engagement erupted in the Karos Drift. Necron tomb ships phased into real space without warp translation, their crescent hulls reflecting starlight like blades. Imperial macro, cannons fired in disciplined broadsides, lances struck true only for necrodermis hulls to reform seconds later. Necron weapons ignored void shields entirely. Cruisers were sliced apart, as though carved from parchment. Entire squadrons vanished in green beams that left nothing behind. Admiral Halbrecht, scarred by Virlax, led the counteroffense, if personally. When conventional tactics failed, he rammed his flagship into a Necron capital ship, overloading both reactors. The detonation lit the nebula with blinding radiance. The engagement was declared a victory. Yet even in triumph, auger arrays detected additional tomb activations across 3 neighboring systems. The Necrons were not responding emotionally. They were executing a galactic-scale reclamation protocol. Across the Imperium, whispers spread among the Inquisition and Adeptus Mechanicus alike. If Necron warp suppression technology could be harnessed, could it weaken chaos permanently? Could the Emperor's eternal struggle be eased? It was heretical to even consider. But desperation breeds dangerous thoughts. On Terra, fluctuations within the Astronomicon were subtle but measurable. Some attributed it to strain from the Great Rift. Others feared the Ash's influence creeping ever closer to Sol. The Black Ash Crusade escalated from planetary purges to sector-wide warfare. Entire systems were quarantined. Refugee fleets fled through unstable warp corridors. Space Marine strike teams descended into half-awakened tomb worlds to destroy central reactors before full activation. Sometimes they succeeded, often they did not, because for every tomb complex destroyed, data recovered revealed dozens more lying dormant beneath unsuspecting Imperial colonies. Worlds thought safe for millennia had been built atop ancient Necron domains. Humanity had inherited a galaxy it did not understand. And now the original owners were rising. Overlord Zathrek calculated each Imperial response without anger. Organic life exhibited predictable fear, based aggression. Exterminatus merely accelerated atmospheric dispersal of ash particles. In attempting containment, the Imperium was spreading activation further. From his perspective, humanity was assisting in its own displacement. The Black Ash drifted across star systems like a patient tide, silent, methodical, unstoppable. And for the first time in centuries, even the most devout servants of the Emperor began to ask a question they dared not speak aloud. What if this war cannot be won? Because the Necrons do not tire, they do not doubt, they do not fear extinction, they have already endured it once. And as more emerald eyes ignite beneath the crusts of forgotten worlds, one truth becomes undeniable in the grim darkness of the far future. The Black Ash Crusade is not a campaign of conquest. It is a countdown, and time, in the 41st millennium, is a weapon older than mankind itself. In the 41st millennium, the warp is both curse and lifeline. It is the sea through which Imperial ships travel. It is the beacon sustained by the Emperor of Mankind that guides navigators across impossible distances. It is also the realm of chaos, of gods that feed upon suffering, ambition, decay, and rage. For 10,000 years, humanity has survived by mastering this night, mere dimension just enough to endure it. Now, in the wake of the Black Ash, that nightmare was growing quiet. At first, the change was subtle. Astropathic choirs in ash-adjacent systems reported reduced psychic interference. Warp messages traveled with unusual clarity, but only for short distances. Beyond certain boundaries, communication simply failed, as though swallowed by emptiness. Navigators described regions of the immaterium that felt hollow. Where once there had been raging tides of emotion and color, now there was stillness, a suffocating calm. Then the demons began to falter. On the industrial world of Carthax Roman 9, a minor chaos cult attempted to summon a warp entity during a planetary alignment. The ritual was precise, the sacrifices sufficient, the veil between realities thinned, and nothing answered. Witnesses described a brief flicker of distortion before the summoning circle collapsed inward, imploding into cold ash that matched the particulate matter spreading across the sector. The cultists were executed by the local Arbites, but reports of similar failures spread rapidly. Within the Eye of Terror, warbands devoted to the ruinous powers took notice. Chaos is not patient. It does not tolerate starvation. When Necron warp suppression fields expanded across multiple systems, cutting off emotional resonance that fed the dark gods. Retaliation came swiftly. Traitor fleets translated from the warp into ash-tainted regions, launching assaults against both Imperial and Necron targets. The irony was brutal. For the first time in recorded history, forces of Chaos and the Imperium found themselves attacking the same enemy. Inquisitor Malvek understood the implications immediately. The Black Ash was not merely activating tomb worlds. It was establishing null zones, regions where warp energy was diminished or entirely suppressed. Ancient Necron pylons, buried beneath planetary crusts, were linking together across interstellar distances. A network, a lattice, a design older than humanity's first empire. Recovered Mechanicus data referenced similar technology deployed during the war in heaven, when the Necrons fought the Old Ones and their psychic creations. Warp suppression had once been their greatest weapon. Now it was returning. Malvek convened a private council aboard the battle barge Indomitable Will, attended by representatives of the Ultramarines and envoys from the Adeptus Mechanicus. The conclusion was stark. If this lattice completes, Malvek stated, entire sectors may become inaccessible to warp travel. The Astronomican's light will not penetrate. Chaos will weaken, but so will we. A Space Marine captain voiced the unspoken question, would that not be victory? Malvek's silence answered more than words. Because the Imperium is built upon the warp, every supply line, every reinforcement fleet, every astropathic command. Remove that, and humanity fractures into isolated islands surrounded by predators. The Necrons did not need to conquer every world. They simply needed to cut the galaxy into pieces. Meanwhile, the Black Ash Crusade intensified. Imperial fleets deployed in expanding cordons, attempting to identify and destroy tomb complexes before full activation. Space Marine strike teams descended into subterranean labyrinths of living metal, battling constructs that reassembled even after catastrophic damage. On the mining world of Dravaris, the Black Templars launched a full-scale ground assault into a partially awakened tomb. For 3 days they fought through corridors that shifted and sealed behind them. Necron immortals advanced in perfect phalanxes, Gauss fire reducing ceramite armor to drifting motes. Chaplain Rhythius led the final push toward the central reactor chamber, chanting litanies of hatred as pylons pulsed with emerald energy. When melted charges were finally placed, the resulting detonation collapsed the tomb complex entirely. Dravaris was saved, but in orbit, auger arrays detected ash plumes erupting from 2 neighboring systems. The Crusade was reacting, the Necrons were executing. Across Segmentum Obscurus, reports of quiet systems multiplied. Entire star clusters where warp travel became impossible. Imperial vessels attempting translation within these regions either failed to enter the Immaterium, or became lost in unstable eddies at the boundaries. Navigators began refusing assignments near ash zones. Some claimed they could feel something vast beyond the veil. Not a presence like chaos, not hunger or malice, absence. And absence terrified them more than demons ever had. Within the tomb world beneath Virlax's shattered remains, Overlord Zathrek processed data from hundreds of awakening nodes. Imperial resistance was within predicted parameters. Chaos interference was inefficient and self-destructive. Probability of full lattice activation increasing. He did not hate humanity. He did not despise chaos. To him, both were aberrations, ephemeral infestations born after his species had already conquered death itself. The galaxy had belonged to the Necrons once. They had traded flesh for immortality. They had shattered star gods. Now they would restore order. Organic unpredictability would be eliminated. Warp turbulence would cease. Reality would stabilize. The galaxy would be silent. In the eye of terror, however, silence was unacceptable. Word reached the warlord known as Vaelthrax the Shattered, champion of chaos undivided. His sorcerers confirmed the reports. Warp currents were thinning near multiple Imperial sectors. Rituals failed, demonic reinforcements flickered, the dark gods were being starved. Veilthrax declared a new campaign, not against the Imperium, but against the metal blasphemers. Traitor Astartes' fleets surged into ash zones, their vessels tearing unstable passages through the warp to reach Necron-controlled systems. The resulting battles defied comprehension. Demons manifested only to disintegrate mid-attack as null fields expanded. Necron pylons emitted pulses that collapsed warp rifts instantly. Chaos sorcerers unleashed storms of empiric fire that scarred necrodermis hulls, but the damage repaired within moments. In one engagement above the world of Theros' reach, a Chaos battleship detonated its warp drive intentionally, creating a localized tear in reality large enough to engulf 3 Necron tomb ships. The explosion annihilated both fleets, and temporarily destabilized the suppression field in that system. For the Imperium, the conflict was both opportunity and nightmare. Inquisitor Malvek made a decision that would earn him eternal suspicion within the Ordo Hereticus. He ordered Imperial forces to withhold engagement during several Chaos Necron confrontations, allowing the two enemies to weaken each other. It was a dangerous gamble, but resources were finite, and the crusade was overstretched. Back on Terra, subtle fluctuations in the Astronomicon caused growing alarm among the High Lords. Though distant from primary ash zones, the beacon's psychic output showed irregular oscillations. Some Adeptus Mechanicus mage theorized resonance interference from the expanding Necron lattice. The thought was unthinkable. If the Astronomicon dimmed even briefly, the Imperium would splinter. Rumors spread among the ecclesiarchy that the Black Ash was divine judgment. Others whispered that perhaps this was the Emperor's hidden plan, to allow the Necrons to purge chaos before humanity reclaimed dominance. Such speculation bordered on heresy, yet desperation reshapes belief. Meanwhile, within multiple ash-affected systems, a new horror emerged. Human populations exposed to prolonged null field conditions began experiencing psychological degradation. Without the subtle background presence of the warp, emotions dulled, dreams ceased, creativity withered. Entire communities became apathetic, moving through daily routines without passion or hope. The warp is dangerous, but it is also the reflection of sentient thought. To diminish it was to diminish something fundamental within humanity itself. Reports described children who no longer laughed, artists unable to imagine, priests delivering sermons to congregations that listened without reaction. The Black Ash was not only sterilizing worlds, it was eroding the soul. Malvek reviewed these reports in silence. Victory over chaos would mean nothing if humanity lost the very essence that defined it. The Black Ash Crusade was no longer a military operation. It was an existential dilemma. Destroy the Necron lattice, and chaos would surge back stronger than ever. Allow it to complete, and the warp would fade, along with the Imperium's ability to function. There was no clean solution. Only survival measured in catastrophic trade-offs. As more tomb worlds awakened, patterns became clear. Key nodal planets were anchoring the suppression network. If enough were destroyed simultaneously, the lattice might destabilize. But these nodes were heavily defended, and time was running out. In the Karos Drift, remnants of Admiral Halbrecht's fleet regrouped under new command. Reinforced by ultramarine strike cruisers, they prepared for a direct assault on one such nodal world. Gathai's Null, a planet where ash storms permanently obscured the sky and warp translation, was nearly impossible. The objective was simple in wording: destroy the primary pylon array. In practice, it meant descending into the heart of a fully awakened Necron dynasty. As Imperial ships approached Gathai's Null, their navigators reported something unprecedented. They could no longer see the Astronomicon. Not because of distance, because the light itself was being bent, deflected by an expanding field of impossible geometry emanating from the planet's surface. For the first time in 10 millennia, an Imperial fleet stood in a region of space where the Emperor's guiding light did not reach. And in that darkness, emerald stars began to rise from the planet below. The galaxy was growing quiet. And silence in the 41st millennium is never mercy, it is preparation. For 10,000 years, the ruinous powers have fed upon the galaxy's endless war. Every act of hatred strengthens Khorne, every scheme empowers Inch, every plague fattens Nurgle, every indulgence exalts Slaanesh. The Immaterium is swollen with the emotions of uncountable trillions. But now, across widening regions of segmentum obscurus, those emotions are no longer reaching them. The black ash spreads, and where it settles, the warp thins. The assault on Gathai's null began without the Astronomican's light to guide it. Imperial navigators described the surrounding warp as a dim corridor, barely navigable, as if reality itself resisted intrusion. Translation into real space was unstable. Several escort frigates were lost before the fleet could even form battle lines. Yet they advanced, because if Gathai's null fell, a major nodal anchor in the Necron suppression lattice would be severed. From orbit, the planet appeared lifeless. Ash storms blanketed continents. Lightning crackled across skies heavy with particulate clouds. Auspec's returns showed enormous geometric structures embedded into the crust pylon arrays arranged in impossible symmetry. Then the Necron fleet rose. Tomb ships phased into existence around the Imperial formation, crescent hulls gliding without visible propulsion. No warp signatures, no translation shockwaves, just presence. The Ultramarine strike cruiser Valen's Honor opened fire first. Lance batteries speared through the void, scoring lines of molten metal across a Necron hull. Macro cannon broadsides followed, disciplined and relentless. The Necrons did not evade, they endured. Necrodermis armor flowed like liquid metal, sealing wounds as quickly as they formed. Return fire lanced outward in precise emerald beams, slicing cleanly through void shields as though they were illusions. An escort cruiser simply vanished, its structure disassembled atom by atom. On the command deck of the Indomitable Will, Inquisitor Malvek watched the engagement unfold with cold calculation. This was no longer merely a battle of attrition, it was a race against inevitability. Deploy the Astartes, he ordered. Thunderhawk gunships screamed toward Gathai's null's surface through storms of ash and anti-air Gauss fire. Space Marines of the Ultramarines and Black Templars descended into a world that felt wrong beneath their boots. The air was thin of psychic resonance. Even transhuman warriors felt it, a subtle absence, like pressure behind the eyes. The pylon complex towered above them, black monoliths etched with glowing green sigils. Energy pulsed between structures in synchronized waves, rippling outward into the upper atmosphere and beyond. This was the lattice anchor, and it had to fall. Necron phalanxes emerged from subterranean apertures in flawless formation. Warriors advanced without hesitation. Immortals took elevated positions along crystalline ridges. Canoptech constructs scuttled across the ash dunes like metallic predators. Bolter fire thundered. Explosions tore through advancing ranks. Yet every fallen Necron body shimmered and phased away, reassembling seconds later behind new defensive lines. The battle was not chaotic, it was mechanical, calculated. Captain Valerius of the Ultramarines pushed toward the central pylon, his power sword carving arcs of blue energy through living metal. Around him, his brothers fought with disciplined fury, reciting catechisms of hate. The Black Templars roared prayers to the Emperor as they charged headlong into Gauss fire, trusting in faith and ceramite. Above them, the sky darkened further, because chaos had arrived. Warp rifts tore open at the system's edge, jagged wounds forced through unstable null fields. Traitor Astartes vessels burst into real space, their hulls warped and screaming with demonic iconography. At their forefront flew the flagship of Veilthrax the Shattered. Chaos had come not to aid the Imperium, but to prevent its own starvation. Demonic entities attempted manifestation across Gathai's null surface. Some succeeded briefly, monstrous forms clawing into existence, only to flicker and dissolve as suppression waves rippled outward from the pylons. The dark gods raged in the Imperium, and for the first time in uncounted centuries, their reach faltered. Vaelthrax ordered his sorcerers to concentrate fire upon the pylon array. Warp lightning crashed against the structures, tearing fragments from their surfaces. The Necrons responded instantly, redirecting defensive constructs toward the new threat. Now 3 powers clashed upon one dying world. Imperial discipline, chaotic fury, Necron inevitability. Captain Valerius reached the base of the primary pylon just as a towering figure materialized before him, Overlord Zathrek himself. The Necron ruler stood taller than any Astartes, his necrodermis body adorned with glyphs denoting ancient sovereignty. In one hand he carried a war scythe crackling with phase energy. Emerald eyes burned with cold awareness. He did not roar, he did not taunt, he simply advanced. Their duel was brutal and precise. Valerius struck with centuries of honed skill, blade flashing in arcs of cerulean light. Zathrek parried effortlessly, his movements devoid of wasted motion. Each strike of the war scythe carved through ceramite as though it were parchment. Around them the battle intensified. Chaos Terminators teleported into the fray, chainfists tearing into Necron constructs. Demonic engines roared defiance as suppression waves weakened their essence. Imperial devastators poured heavy fire into advancing phalanxes. And still the pylons pulsed. In orbit, Admiral Halbrecht's successor made a desperate decision. With Chaos reinforcements pouring in and Necron fleets multiplying, time was nearly exhausted. Prepare Vortex warheads. The order chilled even veteran officers. Vortex weaponry was forbidden in most engagements, its capacity to tear localized holes into the warp unpredictable and catastrophic. But unpredictability was precisely what they needed. Warheads launched toward Gathai's null's surface, streaking through atmosphere in incandescent trails. On the ground, Captain Valerius saw the incoming signatures through his helm display. He understood instantly. Victory or annihilation, there would be no third outcome. He lunged one final time at Zathrek, driving his power sword into the Necron overlord's chest cavity. The blade penetrated, but necrodermis flowed inward, trapping it. Zathrek's war scythe pierced Valerius through the torso, severing vital organs in a single calculated thrust. As the Space Marine fell, the Vortex warhead struck. Reality fractured. A sphere of swirling darkness consumed the central pylon array, ripping matter into a spiraling abyss. Necron constructs were dragged screaming, if they could scream, into the imploding singularity. Chaos Marines were torn apart mid-charge. Imperial Astartes vanished in silence. The primary node collapsed. Across the system, suppression fields flickered violently. In the Imperium, the dark gods howled as a brief surge of warp resonance flooded the region, but the lattice did not shatter. It adapted. Secondary pylons intensified their output, stabilizing the network with eerie precision. Gathai's null's surface was devastated, but the greater structure endured. In orbit, Imperial and Chaos fleets disengaged simultaneously as gravitational distortions threatened to consume them all. Necron ships phased out in perfect retreat, damage calculations already underway. The battle had changed nothing. Except the stakes, Malvek studied the aftermath with grim understanding. Destroying individual nodes would not suffice. The suppression lattice was self-correcting, each anchor reinforcing the others. To dismantle it, they would need to strike at its origin. And there was only one plausible source: the shattered remains of Virlax Prime, the First Awakening. The Central Command. If Zathrek controlled the network from beneath that dead world, then that was where the crusade must end. Meanwhile, within the warp, something unprecedented occurred. The Chaos Gods felt hunger. Minor demonic hosts dissipated entirely in ash-saturated sectors. Warp storms weakened along their peripheries. Cult activity declined not from loyalty, but from emotional dulling. The galaxy's psychic resonance was decreasing, and even the ruinous powers began to understand the danger. If the Necron lattice completed, the great game would end, not with victory, with silence. On Terra, the Astronomicon flickered again, briefly dimming before stabilizing. The High Lords demanded answers the Inquisition could not yet provide. Across the Imperium, fear spread faster than the ash itself, because humanity was caught between annihilation and emptiness, between chaos unbound and a galaxy without soul. As surviving Imperial fleets regrouped for the journey back to Virlax's ruins, one truth became undeniable. This was no longer a crusade for territory. It was a war over the nature of existence itself, and time was running out, because deep within the shattered core of Virlax Prime, Overlord Zathrak calculated the next phase of activation. Probability of full lattice completion, 73%, probability increasing, the galaxy was growing quieter. The Imperium had faced extinction before. Hive fleets that devoured entire sectors, black crusades that split reality, warp storms that swallowed fleets whole. Each time, humanity endured through fury, faith, and sacrifice. But this was different. The Black Ash did not rage. It did not conquer with banners raised. It erased. As the Crusade fleets gathered for the return to Virlax Prime's shattered remains, the galaxy felt smaller. Entire regions were now unreachable by warp translation. Astropathic messages arrived fragmented or not at all. Worlds once separated by weeks of travel were now isolated islands in a dark sea of silence. The Astronomicon still burned upon Terra under the suffering vigilance of the Emperor of Mankind, but its light bent strangely near ash-saturated sectors, refracted by the expanding Necron lattice. Humanity was not losing a war, it was losing connection. The remains of Virlax Prime orbited its dying star as a broken halo of debris. The Exterminatus had shattered the world, but it had not ended the awakening. Augur scans revealed impossible energy signatures deep within the planetary fragments, organized, synchronized, alive. This was the origin node, the heart of the lattice. Inquisitor Malvek stood upon the command deck of the Indomitable Will, watching the fractured world rotate slowly beneath. Around him gathered what remained of the Black Ash Crusade Imperial Navy vessels scarred from countless engagements, Space Marine strike cruisers bearing the sigils of multiple chapters, Mechanicus, arc ships bristling with experimental weaponry. Even a contingent of Grey Knights had arrived, their presence silent and ominous. They had all reached the same conclusion. If Virlax was not destroyed completely, the galaxy would fall into permanent null. But destruction would not be simple. The Necron fleet encircled the debris field in flawless formation. Tomb ships phased in and out of real space, repositioning without warp signatures. Massive pylons had been reconstructed across floating continental fragments, forming a three-dimensional lattice in vacuum. The Black Ash drifted thick as fog. Malvek addressed the assembled commanders with brutal clarity. This is not a battle for territory, it is a battle for the warp itself. If we fail, chaos may weaken. But so will we. Humanity will fracture into isolation. The Imperium will collapse into silence. No one argued, because they all understood. The assault began with a synchronized barrage from every capital ship in the fleet. Lance beams and macro shells streaked across space, detonating against Necron defenses in blinding cascades of light. Mechanicus vessels unleashed gravitic distorters designed specifically to destabilize phase-shifted materials. For a moment the void burned brighter than a newborn sun. Then the Necrons answered. Pylon arrays flared in unison, projecting overlapping null fields that disrupted targeting arrays and dampened plasma reactions mid-discharge. Imperial munitions detonated prematurely or lost cohesion entirely. Tomb ships advanced without urgency. They did not need speed, they needed inevitability. Boarding torpedoes launched from space marine cruisers, punching through necrodermis hulls and deploying Astartes into corridors of living metal. Grey Knights teleported directly into energy conduits, their nemesis weapons crackling with psychic force despite the oppressive null aura. On the surface, fragments of Virelax, Ultramarines, and Black Templars established footholds upon jagged continents, suspended in vacuum, advancing towards central spires that pulsed with lattice energy. Everywhere they struck, Necron resistance was precise, calculated. Overlord Zathrek observed from the core nexus chamber, suspended within a cathedral of black metal and emerald light. Data streams flowed through his consciousness, fleet positions, energy fluctuations, probability matrices. The Imperium was committing everything, predictable. He initiated final convergence. Across the debris field, pylons intensified their output. Suppression waves expanded outward in concentric spheres. Warp signatures collapsed as though suffocated. Even the Grey Knights staggered, their psychic powers flickering like candles in windless air. In the Immaterium, the reaction was violent. The dark gods felt the constriction tightening. Within the Eye of Terror, warp storms surged in fury as chaos sought to push back against erasure. Traitor fleets once again hurled themselves toward Virelax, tearing unstable corridors through thinning currents. For the first time in the Black Ash Crusade, Imperial and Chaos vessels arrived in the same battle space simultaneously, not as allies, but as enemies with a shared existential threat. Vaelthrax the Shattered transmitted a single message across open Vox channels. The galaxy will not be silenced. His fleet charged directly into the Necron perimeter, unleashing war-enhanced bombardments that destabilized multiple outer pylons. Demonic entities forced manifestation through sheer willpower, clawing into real space despite suppression waves. They lasted seconds before dissolving, but seconds were enough to fracture defensive harmonics. Malvec seized the moment. All fleets target central nexus, full power, no reserve. In orbit, plasma reactors were overdriven beyond safe thresholds. Mechanicus Mage, I chanted binaric prayers as experimental weapons were activated without complete testing. Space Marine vessels rammed tomb ships at close quarters, detonating reactors in suicidal fury. On the largest surviving fragment of Virelax, a combined strike force of Ultramarines, Black Templars, and Grey Knights breached the entrance to the Nexus chamber. What they found was not chaos, it was order perfected. Pillars of black metal stretched into infinity, inscribed with glyphs older than humanity. Energy coursed through geometric patterns that defied Euclidean logic. At the chamber's center stood Zathrek. He did not attack immediately. Instead, he spoke. His voice was metallic and resonant, echoing through translation algorithms embedded in the chamber itself. Organic existence is instability. Instability births suffering. Suffering feeds entropy. We will end entropy. A Grey Knight Grandmaster stepped forward, psychic aura flaring defiantly. You will end life. Life is noise, Zathrek replied, and then the chamber erupted into violence. Nemesis blades clashed against phase. War scythes, storm bolters roared in thunderous volleys. Necron Lichguard formed a living shield around their overlord, intercepting blows with mechanical precision. Despite suppression fields, the Grey Knights forced psychic energy into existence through sheer discipline, their powers manifesting in violent bursts that shattered necrodermis bodies. Yet for every construct destroyed, another rose from the floor itself. The Nexus pulsed brighter. In orbit, suppression waves reached unprecedented intensity. The Astronomicon flickered violently, visible even through Auspex distortions. For a heartbeat, one terrible heartbeat, Imperial navigators lost sight of the Emperor's light entirely. Panic spread across command decks. If the beacon failed, even momentarily, millions of vessels across the Imperium could become lost in the warp. On Terra, alarms sounded within the Imperial Palace. the Golden Throne surged. Across the galaxy, Psychers cried out as a shockwave of blinding psychic force radiated from Holy Terra itself. The Astronomicon flared brighter than it had in centuries, punching through suppression fields with incandescent fury. The Emperor did not speak, but his light answered. At Virlax, the surge destabilized the lattice for precious seconds. Pylon harmonics faltered. Warp resonance flooded back into the system in a tidal wave. Chaos ships roared in triumph as demonic reinforcements surged into reality with renewed strength. Within the Nexus chamber, the sudden psychic influx empowered the Grey Knights. Their blades burned like stars, carving through Lichguard ranks. The Grand Master struck Zathrek directly, cracking his necrodermis shell and exposing the luminous core within. For the first time, probability calculations shifted dramatically. Zathrek assessed the data in microseconds. Victory no longer optimal. Preservation required adaptation. He initiated Cataclysm Protocol. The Nexus chamber began overloading, drawing energy from every remaining pylon in the debris field. If the lattice could not be completed, it would detonate, releasing a suppression pulse vast enough to permanently nullify warp activity across multiple sectors. It would be a final act of denial. Malvek, monitoring energy spikes from orbit, understood instantly. If the core detonated, the resulting null wave could cripple the Imperium beyond recovery. He made the final decision.